I'd always loved camping alone. Something about the quiet of the forest and the complete freedom of it had always appealed to me. So, when I had a free weekend, I decided to head out to a spot I hadn't been to in years. It was a little more remote than most places I camped, far from the popular trails and tucked away from any cell service. Just me, my tent, and miles of wilderness. The hike was longer than I remembered, and I reached the spot just before sunset. The trees were dense here, towering pines that seemed to block out half the sky, and the ground was thick with underbrush. I set up my tent and started a small fire to cook dinner. As the light faded, the air grew colder, and the silence of the forest settled around me. After eating, I put out the fire and got into my tent, zipping it up tight. I lay there in my sleeping bag, just listening to the forest sounds. The occasional rustle of leaves, the soft calls of distant birds. I felt completely alone, in a way that was both peaceful and eerie. It must have been around midnight when I woke up. Something had startled me out of sleep, but I didn't know what. I lay there, listening to the silence, when I heard it, footsteps outside my tent. Slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing. My first thought was that it had to be an animal, but as I listened, I realized the steps were too steady, too measured. They sounded like a person walking slowly around my campsite. I lay completely still, barely breathing, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. Whoever was outside moved with purpose, circling my tent. Then, the footsteps stopped, and I could hear a faint scratching sound, like something brushing against the fabric of the tent. It was light, almost hesitant, but enough to send a chill down my spine. I stayed frozen, unsure of what to do. My flashlight was next to me, but I was too afraid to reach for it, afraid that the light would draw attention. After a few minutes, the scratching stopped, and everything went silent again. I listened, my ears straining for any sound, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling, just the thick, heavy quiet of the forest. I lay there, staring into the darkness, trying to convince myself it was nothing, that maybe it had been an animal after all. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. When I woke up again, it was still dark, but something felt wrong. There was a smell, an awful sour stench like rotting meat. It was strong, hanging in the air around my tent, and my stomach turned. I sat up, feeling a surge of panic. I had to get out of there. I unzipped the tent cautiously, poking my head out. The smell was even stronger outside, and as my eyes adjusted, I saw something lying near the edge of my campsite. It was a dead animal, a deer, its body twisted and torn, as if it had been dragged there and left. The ground around it was disturbed, the dirt churned up with what looked like footprints leading into the trees. My hands were shaking as I packed up my things as quickly as I could. I left the tent behind, too afraid to stay a minute longer than necessary. As I started hiking out, I kept looking over my shoulder, the sense that I was being watched never leaving me. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind felt like something following, something close. The hike back to the car felt endless, and I didn't relax until I was safely inside, doors locked. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing there, watching me. I never went back to that spot. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there that night, leaving a dead animal by my tent and circling in the darkness. I still camp, but I always stick to the more popular spots now, where I know there are other people nearby. Whatever happened that night, it was enough to remind me that, out there in the woods, you're never as alone as you think. It was late October, and I thought a solo camping trip might be the perfect way to unwind. The idea of disconnecting and just being in nature sounded right, and I'd camped alone plenty of times before. I packed up everything I'd need: tent, food, flashlight, extra clothes, and drove out to a spot in the mountains I'd visited once before with friends. It was a bit isolated but beautiful, with tall pines and a small, clear river cutting through the valley below. I set up camp about 2 miles from where I'd parked, away from the few trails in the area. By the time I got everything ready, it was late afternoon. I spent a couple of hours hiking around and then made a small fire to cook dinner as the sun went down. There was something peaceful about sitting out there, just me and the quiet sounds of the woods. I had no cell service, but that was part of the appeal. No distractions, just silence and solitude. As the fire died down and the darkness settled in, I felt a sense of calm, sitting there with only the crackling embers for light. But then, just past the glow of the fire, I heard what sounded like someone moving through the trees. My first thought was that maybe an animal was out there, but the sound was too controlled, too steady. It was footsteps, clear and deliberate, and they were getting closer. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe another camper, but I knew that wasn't right. I was off any main path, and it was too late for anyone to be wandering around in the dark. The footsteps stopped just beyond the ring of light from my fire, and I strained to see anything out there, but it was pitch black. For a few long minutes, everything was silent. I could feel my pulse racing, a tense silence wrapping around me. After what felt like forever, the footsteps started again, this time circling the edge of the clearing, slowly and deliberately. Whoever it was wasn't coming closer, but was moving around the perimeter. It was as if they were waiting or watching, testing my reaction. I didn't move, didn't want to draw attention, hoping they'd just go away. But the circling continued, and my fear was turning to panic. I kept my flashlight in my hand, ready, but I didn't dare turn it on, afraid it would give away exactly where I was. I felt trapped in my own camp, not sure what to do. Then, just as suddenly as the sounds began, they stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. I waited, listening for any hint of movement, but everything was still. I sat there for a long time, barely breathing, expecting those footsteps to start up again, but they didn't. Eventually, I heard something farther off in the trees, a single snap of a branch, and then, slowly, the woods returned to their usual sounds. Whoever or whatever had been out there was gone. I waited until the first light of dawn before I packed up. I didn't sleep at all. I just sat by the dying embers, eyes darting around the shadows, heart pounding with every small sound. When morning finally came, I packed up as fast as I could and hiked out, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I got back to my car, I felt a weight lift off my chest, a flood of relief. As I drove back, I kept thinking about those footsteps and that strange, deliberate circling in the dark. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there, watching me, testing my limits, just beyond the light. It was like they were toying with me, letting me know they were there without showing themselves. I still go camping sometimes, but I haven't gone alone since that night. Whatever was out there, it wasn't an animal. It was someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and it made me realize just how vulnerable I'd been. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, a way to clear my head. I drove out alone to a spot I'd heard about from a friend, a little-known area tucked far off any marked trail. It was deep enough into the forest that the air felt cleaner, untouched by other campers. I arrived just before sunset, parked my car on the rough, narrow path, and hiked in about half a mile to find a clearing. The forest was dense and quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of every step, every movement around you. I set up my tent and got a fire going, cooking a simple dinner and settling in to watch the stars come out. It was peaceful, exactly what I had come here for, and I felt the stress of the past few weeks start to fade away. But as night fell, that peacefulness turned into something different. It was darker out here than I'd expected. The fire only lit a small circle around me, and beyond it, everything disappeared into shadows. The sounds of the forest changed too, from birds and squirrels to things I couldn't quite identify. Snaps and rustles that seemed to grow louder as the night deepened. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just animals. Around midnight, I put out the fire and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. I lay there in the dark, listening to the quiet sounds outside, waiting to drift off to sleep. At some point, I woke up. I didn't know what time it was, but everything felt still, too still. Then I heard it, footsteps. They were heavy, slow, and deliberate, crunching on leaves and twigs just outside my tent. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I hadn't heard anyone approach. No voices, no distant sounds of a flashlight or anything. Just these slow, measured steps circling my campsite. I lay there, too afraid to move. The steps grew closer, slow and steady, like whoever it was had no intention of hiding. They circled around my tent, stopped for a second, then started again, as if they were thinking about something, weighing a decision. I held my breath, hoping they'd move on, but they didn't. They just kept circling, pausing, circling again. After a few minutes that felt like hours, the footsteps finally faded, retreating back into the forest. I stayed perfectly still, my ears straining, but the footsteps didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I must have dozed off, though it was a light, restless sleep. When morning finally came, I wasted no time. I stepped out of the tent, scanning the ground. Sure enough, there were footprints, large and distinct, circling my tent in the soft earth. They weren't mine, and the depth of them suggested whoever it was had stood still for quite a while. I looked around, but there was no one, no sign of anyone else having camped nearby. Packing up, I noticed something that sent a shiver down my spine. Just a few feet from where I had pitched my tent, tucked into the bushes, I found an old, weathered hunting knife stuck into a tree, as if someone had deliberately left it there. The blade was rusty, worn from time, but it looked like it had been placed recently, maybe the night before. I left quickly, my mind racing the entire hike back to the car. The knife, the footprints, the heavy footsteps circling my tent, they all felt like warnings. That feeling of being watched, of someone walking around my camp, hadn't been my imagination. I never did figure out who was out there with me, or why they left the knife, but it made something clear to me. Some places in the woods are best left alone. I haven't been back since, and I don't plan to. I decided to go camping alone. I'd been working non-stop, and I thought a weekend in the wilderness would be a great way to clear my head. I chose a remote area, far from popular trails, the kind of spot where you could go a whole weekend without seeing another person. It sounded perfect. I hiked out a couple of miles before I found a spot that seemed good. It was right by a small stream with flat ground for the tent and thick trees all around. I set up camp, made a small fire, and cooked a simple dinner. As the sun set, the forest turned quiet, the way it does when it's so far from any roads or houses. It felt peaceful, just me and the sounds of the forest. Wind in the trees, water running over rocks, and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. After a while, I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and drifted off. I didn't sleep long. At some point in the night, I woke up suddenly, that feeling of being watched prickling at the back of my neck. It was pitch dark, and I lay there listening. At first, it was quiet, but then I heard something. A crunching sound, like footsteps moving slowly, carefully, over dry leaves. My first thought was a deer or maybe a raccoon sniffing around, but the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. They circled my tent, moving in slow, uneven steps. Whoever or whatever it was didn't seem in a hurry. I held my breath, every muscle tense, listening as the steps stopped on the far side of the tent. Then I heard another noise, something scraping against the fabric, like fingers or maybe a knife. I was paralyzed. My mind raced, wondering who would be out here so far off the main trails, so far from any other campsites. My heart pounded as I lay there, praying the stranger would just go away. Finally, the scraping stopped, and the footsteps slowly moved away, fading into the darkness. I lay there, every sound amplified, trying to stay calm, telling myself it was just a hunter or maybe a lost hiker. Somehow, I drifted off again, but it was a restless, uneasy sleep. At dawn, I crawled out of the tent, scanning the area around me. The dirt near my tent was disturbed, and I saw boot prints leading away from where I'd been sleeping, disappearing into the woods. It was like someone had just stood there, watching. I didn't stick around. I packed up as fast as I could, checking over my shoulder constantly. The whole way back to the car, I felt jumpy, every rustle in the bushes setting me on edge. When I finally reached my car and shut the door behind me, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of those footsteps outside my tent, the way they circled me, the slow scrape of something against the fabric. I still don't know who was out there that night or what they wanted, but that trip reminded me of something I'd somehow forgotten. Just because the woods are quiet doesn't mean you're alone. It was early autumn, and I'd driven a few hours out of town to a remote lake I'd found online. The idea of spending the weekend away from people sounded perfect, just me, my tent, and the quiet sounds of nature. I found a nice spot near the water, away from the main trails, surrounded by thick trees. The sun was setting when I finally got my camp set up, painting the sky in shades of red and orange. Everything felt right, calm, alone. The first night went by smoothly. The stars were out, bright and clear, and I slept deeply, with just the gentle sound of the lake in the background. The next day, I spent most of my time exploring, climbing a small hill nearby to get a better view. I didn't see anyone all day, not one person, which felt strange, but I figured that was part of the appeal of going somewhere so remote. When evening came, I built a small fire and ate dinner, letting the silence of the forest settle over me as darkness closed in. That night, something changed. I woke up suddenly, heart racing, without knowing why. I lay still, listening. At first, it was just the normal sounds of the forest leaves rustling in the wind, branches creaking. But then, in the distance, I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping. It sounded like something metallic, almost like someone was hitting a rock with a stick. The sound was odd, not something you'd expect out there, but I figured maybe it was an animal knocking something over or messing around. The tapping continued, though slow and steady, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't random. It sounded too deliberate, like someone was taking their time, pacing themselves. Every time it stopped, the silence felt heavier, pressing in around me. I lay there for hours listening, muscles tense. At some point, I drifted off, but the tapping stuck in my mind, echoing in my dreams. The next morning, I got out of the tent and walked around, looking for signs of anything unusual. Nothing. No footprints, no broken branches. Just silence and the distant, empty lake. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. I spent the day fishing and relaxing, and by the time evening came, I almost felt normal again. But that night, the tapping returned, only closer. It sounded like it was coming from the other side of the lake, echoing across the water. Every few seconds, a slow, metallic tap, then silence. Tap, silence. I felt a creeping unease growing in me, the kind you can't brush off with logic. I could see nothing in the dark, no movement, No light from another campfire. I told myself it was just a strange echo, that maybe it was some animal behavior I didn't know about. Still, I didn't sleep that night. I sat up, listening, wide-eyed and tense, waiting for the first light of dawn. When it finally came, I packed up immediately, the tapping still playing in my head. I hiked back to my car without stopping, feeling that prickling sensation on the back of my neck like someone was watching me. When I finally got to the car, I threw my gear in and started the engine, heart racing, eager to leave that silence behind. As I drove away, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Along the edge of the road, leading out of the forest, were boot prints in the dirt. They were fresh, deep, like someone had been walking slowly, deliberately, and they were spaced evenly apart, almost like they'd been made to the beat of a slow, tapping rhythm. I never found out who or what was making that sound, but I knew one thing: I'd been wrong. I wasn't alone that weekend, and the thought of those footsteps still haunts me. I decided to go camping alone for a weekend to clear my head. The spot I chose was remote, miles away from any marked trail, deep in a national forest. I'd been hiking for hours before I found a flat spot near a small clearing and set up my tent. By the time I got everything ready, it was already late afternoon. I gathered some firewood and cooked a quick meal as the sun dipped below the trees. The silence of the woods was both peaceful and heavy, but that's what I wanted: a break from everything and everyone. As night fell, the forest felt darker than usual. The only light came from my small fire and the dim glow of my flashlight. I wasn't too bothered. I'd camped alone before and figured I'd sleep just fine. But then, around midnight, I woke up suddenly. It was that kind of wake up where you don't remember dreaming or stirring. You're just suddenly awake, alert, and aware of the darkness around you. I lay there in my sleeping bag, trying to figure out why I'd woken up. Then, I heard it, a low, steady thump, like something heavy dropping onto the ground. It was close, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. At first, I thought it could be a branch falling or maybe a deer moving through the brush. I tried to calm myself, thinking of all the normal things that could make a sound like that in the woods. But the thumping sound came again, and this time it was closer, a few steps away from my tent. My heart started racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was deliberately walking toward me. I lay there, holding my breath, listening, trying to figure out what it could be. Then, I heard what sounded like deep, uneven breathing, slow and heavy, just outside my tent. I stayed as still as possible, my mind racing through every survival tip I knew. I didn't dare turn on my flashlight. The breathing paused, then the thumping steps resumed, circling my tent. It was too deliberate to be an animal. It felt too close, too careful. The sound circled around my tent twice before stopping on the side where my head was. I felt my pulse pounding as I waited in the silence, every muscle tense. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Minutes passed, and I didn't hear anything else. No movement, no breathing. I waited in my sleeping bag for what felt like hours, listening, waiting for any sign that it was still there. But the forest was completely silent. Eventually, fatigue won, and I fell into an uneasy sleep. When dawn broke, I unzipped my tent and looked around. The ground was wet from morning dew, but I could see marks in the dirt, large, heavy boot prints. They circled my tent in a perfect, eerie loop, right where I'd heard the footsteps. Whoever or whatever had been there hadn't just walked by. They had walked all the way around my tent, slowly, then left without a trace. I packed up quickly, not bothering to eat breakfast, my eyes darting to every shadow and every tree as I made my way back to the main trail. The marks around my tent told me everything I needed to know. Someone had been out there, watching me, close enough to touch the thin fabric between us. I never saw them, never found out who it was, but it was enough to keep me from ever camping alone again. The trip started out peaceful enough. I'd been needing a break from the everyday routine, and camping seemed like the perfect way to clear my head. I chose a spot in a remote forest, a few miles off the main trail, where I'd camped once before. I felt comfortable there, familiar with the trails, the sounds of the woods, even the isolation. It was exactly what I needed. I hiked in with everything I needed, set up my tent near a small clearing, and spent the day wandering the trails. As evening approached, the woods grew quieter, and the temperature began to drop. I sat by my fire, warmed up some food, and watched the stars gradually brighten overhead. The silence felt heavy, but it was a good kind of silence, like the forest was settling in for the night. I decided to turn in early, knowing that the night would be long and cold. Sometime in the night, I woke up to the sound of crunching leaves. It wasn't loud, but distinct enough to snap me out of my half-sleep. I lay there, listening, telling myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. The forest was full of sounds, after all, and I'd camped enough times to know not to jump at every little noise. But then the crunching grew louder, heavier, like something or someone was moving slowly around my campsite. My first thought was another camper, maybe lost or just curious. But that didn't sit right. I hadn't seen anyone for miles when I hiked in, and I'd chosen a spot well off any major trail. The footsteps circled my tent once, then again, and I could feel my pulse quicken. Lying there, I didn't want to make a sound, afraid whoever was out there would notice I was awake. I held my breath, trying to listen. Whoever it was, they were moving methodically, not like someone just wandering through. They were staying close to the tent, as if waiting for something. After what felt like forever, the sounds drifted further away, and I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. I felt tense, like every part of me was on high alert, but I forced myself to stay calm, telling myself that maybe it was just a hunter or a camper who'd gone a little too far from their sight. I convinced myself it was just an odd coincidence, and after a while, exhaustion took over, and I fell into an uneasy sleep. When morning came, I stepped out of the tent, half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I saw it, fresh footprints in the dirt around my tent. They weren't mine. They were large, and they clearly circled my tent, looping back on themselves in several tight circles, like someone had been watching me. The prints led off in the direction of the trail, then disappeared into the underbrush. I packed up quickly, not even stopping to make breakfast. I wanted to get out of there, to put distance between myself and whatever had been out there. As I hiked back, I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way I hadn't felt before. The woods felt different, no longer a place of peace, but something darker. Something that held secrets I wasn't meant to see. When I finally reached my car, I looked back at the trailhead, half expecting to see someone or something lurking there. But it was empty, just the silent trees standing guard. I climbed in, locked the doors, and drove off without looking back. Since that night, I haven't been able to shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, knows I was there. It wasn't a ghost or some monster, just another person. But sometimes the thought of who they might have been and why they were watching me feels scarier than anything I could have imagined. I haven't been camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. I remember it was just supposed to be a quiet weekend, a break from the noise of the city. A friend and I had planned a camping trip, but at the last minute he canceled. I decided to go alone, thinking some solitude would be good for me. I packed light, just the basics: a tent, sleeping bag, food, and a flashlight. The place I chose was off the beaten path, deep in the forest. It wasn't a spot frequented by many campers, and that's exactly what I wanted. A place far from the usual trails, where I could be alone with my thoughts. The hike in was peaceful, just me and the sounds of the forest. I found a nice, secluded spot by a creek and set up camp. As evening crept in, the air got colder, and the forest grew quieter, but I didn't mind. I was used to camping, comfortable with the woods, even at night. As darkness fully settled, I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal. The stars came out, and I sat there for a while, watching the flames dance, feeling the cool night air on my skin. The silence around me was thick, almost heavy, but that's how it is in the deep woods. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the quiet rustling of leaves. I turned in early, planning to hike further into the woods the next day. Sometime during the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was a sound, maybe just a feeling, but something was off. Lying there, I listened, straining to hear anything beyond the usual noises. After a few moments, I heard it, a faint rustling, something moving around my campsite. My first thought was a raccoon or some other small animal, so I stayed still, hoping it would pass. But the rustling grew closer, heavier, more deliberate. This wasn't the sound of a small animal. I held my breath, barely moving, and then I heard something that made my blood go cold. Soft, steady footsteps. Someone or something was walking around my tent. I felt a surge of panic, but I fought it down, telling myself it was just another camper, maybe lost or curious. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. I was miles off the main trails, and no one knew I was here. I waited, lying still, heart pounding so loud I thought whoever was outside could hear it. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent, and I could see a faint shadow moving. They stood there, barely moving, for what felt like an eternity. Then, as silently as they had come, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance until everything was quiet again. I lay there, wide awake, every sound in the forest amplified in my mind. I didn't dare move, didn't even reach for my flashlight. I just lay there, listening, waiting, until eventually exhaustion took over, and I fell into a light, uneasy sleep. When the first light of dawn crept through my tent, I sat up, my body tense and sore from the night's events. I unzipped the tent cautiously, peering outside, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was no one. The only evidence of the night was a strange set of boot prints circling my tent, deep and deliberate in the dirt. They weren't mine, and they led off into the woods, disappearing into the thick brush. I didn't waste time packing up. I was shaken, more than I wanted to admit, and the quiet solitude of the woods no longer felt peaceful. I headed back to the trail, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, feeling eyes on me even though I was alone. When I finally reached my car, the relief was overwhelming. As I drove away, I thought about those footprints, the way they circled my tent, stopping just inches from where I lay inside. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, not out of curiosity, but something darker. I never found out who or what it was, but that was the last time I went camping alone. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. Just me, the stars, and the quiet of the woods. I arrived at the campsite in the early evening, setting up my tent near a small lake surrounded by tall pines. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky orange and pink. I built a fire, roasted some marshmallows, and enjoyed the peaceful sounds of nature. As darkness fell, the woods transformed. The rustling of leaves and the distant hoots of owls became more pronounced. I sat by the fire, listening to the crackling flames and watching the shadows dance on the trees. It felt like I was the only person in the world. After a while, I decided to go for a short walk around the lake. The moonlight shimmered on the water, making it look almost magical. I felt calm and relaxed, but soon, a strange feeling crept over me. The woods were eerily quiet, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. I brushed it off, thinking it was just my imagination. I returned to my campsite, but the uneasy feeling lingered. I tucked myself into my sleeping bag, trying to focus on the sound of the fire crackling outside. Just as I began to drift off, I heard a noise. It was faint, like a twig snapping. I sat up, heart racing, listening closely. Then silence. I told myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon and tried to sleep again. But then the noise came again. This time it was louder, closer. I held my breath, straining to hear. It was followed by a low, muffled sound that sent chills down my spine. I felt a sudden rush of fear. I knew I had to see what it was. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The air was cold and still. I pointed the beam of light into the darkness, scanning the area around my tent. Nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the wind. But then, I saw something move near the edge of the woods. My heart raced. It was too big to be an animal, but too far away to see clearly. I felt panic rising inside me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. Then, a loud crash came from the direction of the movement. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. My instincts kicked in, and I bolted back to the tent, zipping it shut tightly behind me. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening to the sounds outside. The noises faded, but I could still hear the occasional rustle in the trees. I felt trapped, waiting for dawn. Finally, the first light of morning peeked through the tent. Exhausted but relieved, I unzipped the door and stepped outside. The campsite was untouched. My fire had burned out and the lake was calm. But as I looked around, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A large set of footprints led from the edge of the woods right to my tent. They were too big to belong to a bear and looked like a man's. I quickly packed up my gear, my hands shaking. I didn't want to stick around to find out who or what had been watching me. As I drove away, I glanced back at the woods. They looked peaceful again, but I knew the truth. I had escaped, but I would never forget the fear I felt that night. From that day on, I promised myself to never camp alone again. I should have never agreed to this camping trip. The idea of being out in the middle of nowhere, away from my phone signal, was something I joked about with friends before, but actually being here was different. We were deep in the woods, far from any town, and the only signs of civilization were our tents and a few barely visible paths we'd followed to get here. The night was dark, darker than I'd ever seen. We didn't have the comfort of streetlights, just the weak glow of our campfire and some dim, fading flashlights. Around us, the trees were thick, their twisted branches casting strange shadows that seemed to dance along with the flickering light. Every so often, I'd hear a twig snap in the distance, but I told myself it was just an animal. Still, the hair on the back of my neck prickled with every sound. It was when the fire started to die down that I began to feel really uneasy. I was tired and cold, so I crawled into my tent, zipping it shut and pulling my sleeping bag over me. The air felt damp, and everything outside was silent now, almost too quiet. I couldn't help but feel like something was off. Just as I was finally dozing off, I heard what sounded like footsteps outside. They were slow and deliberate, crunching against the dried leaves on the forest floor. At first, I told myself it was just one of my friends, maybe needing to use the bathroom or stretch their legs. But the footsteps didn't sound like they were moving in any particular direction. Instead, it was as if someone was circling around the tents, moving closer and then farther, pacing in a way that felt wrong. Lying there, holding my breath, I listened intently. The footsteps stopped, and a new sound replaced them. The unmistakable creak of fabric, like someone's hand pressing against the tent wall. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. Whoever or whatever was out there, I could feel their presence right by my head, separated only by the thin layer of nylon. My mind raced through every possibility. An animal? Another camper lost and wandering? But neither felt right. The weight of that hand lingered, pressing against the tent, and then slowly, it slid away. After a few minutes of dead silence, I decided I had to know what was going on. I unzipped my sleeping bag as quietly as I could, clutching my flashlight, my hand shaking as I aimed it toward the zipper of the tent. My plan was simple: peek out quickly, confirm that it was nothing, and then go back to pretending I was asleep. But when I looked outside, there was nothing. No animals, no campers, nothing that would explain the sounds. Just the thick, dark forest staring back at me. I closed the tent, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it. Maybe just the combination of exhaustion and nerves. The next morning, we were all up early, packing our things to head back to the car. I didn't mention what had happened, assuming it was a personal nightmare or some strange hallucination from the night before. But as I rolled up my tent, I noticed something on the side where I'd heard that pressing sound. A streak of mud, smeared like a handprint, right where my head had been. It was clear and deliberate, just one large hand, unmistakably human. I didn't say a word, just hurried to finish packing. Whatever had been out there, it was gone now. But as we walked back along that narrow, twisting path, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd narrowly avoided something that we'd never quite understand.